Welcome to Lawrence County History Corner. This week I'm going to talk a little bit about Kitts Hill. We had a patron request from online about some information about Kitts Hill. So hopefully I will give them a couple stories and they'll enjoy it. Kitts Hill itself was named for the family of a farmer who settled there in the 1870s from Noble County. His name was Edward F. Kitts. He was, though born in 1844, he settled in the Kitts Hill area with his wife, Mary Farson Kitts, and they there had 9 children. Among the children were a daughter, Lavinia Jane, Louisa Esther, Rosanna, Mary Ann, who died sadly at a young age, Dora Alice, Luther Frank, Edward Simpson, and Carrie Bell. The Kitts family continued to live in that area. Luther Frank, who was one of the children of Edward F., he had married originally a woman named Emma Willis. And then when Emma passed, he had married again to a Mabel Schaefer. They had 5 children, and his house is still located in Dog Fork. I actually am getting some of this from the Kitts Hill book, A Rural Appalachian Community in Southern Ohio by Marilyn Thornton Schraff. So if you're looking for information about Kitts Hill, this is a good place to start. Luther settled in had his home in Dog Fork, and he and his first wife had 3 children: Norval, who died as a toddler, Noble, and Carrie. Of course, and Emma Willis died when her children were quite small, and so Luther began courting Mabel Schaefer. Now, Mabel Schaefer was the daughter of a postmaster at Aid, and she was also a school teacher. They married in 1909 and continued to live at Dog Fork until Luther took over running the store and post office for his father. Edward Franklin, at which time they moved into the family home on top of Kitts Hill, and like I said, the Luther family home was in Dog Fork. And it would later become the home of the Isaac Roberts family. That is just a little piece about Kitts Hill history, and there'll be more to come. The storm that spawned the flooding in Scotttown also struck other areas. And in the semi-weekly Irontonian on the 8th of June, 1906, there is a description by the Wilgus, according to the newspaper correspondent. He talks about at 2 o'clock in the morning when the most severe storm hits the county. One of the most severe storms that ever hit Lawrence County, that section of Lawrence County, passed over Wilgus. But just after the storm passed over the Trace Creek Hill, Valley Hill, it met the one with the south. And of course, that was the one that they said caused the most damage. The damage done in Long Creek Valley was slight compared to what happened in Scotttown. Long Creek was at the highest at its highest as it is ever known, according to the oldest residents in the area. But aside from the damage to crops and some stock, people living on Long Creek was uninjured. At Scotttown, however, that was not true. There was at least 1 fatality, and there were many others suspected. E. Schaefer's house near Trace Creek was moved off its foundation. Wall's store was washed away entirely, as was Jesse Burcham's store. And 1 mile above Scotttown, the Jesse Burcham store was taken 1 mile above Scotttown, down a creek. The post office in the village also was taken down the creek and ripped off its foundation. Water was up to the top of the counter in the platform store owned by and then John Dobbs, the veteran harness maker, and his wife had to be rescued. 2 feet of water was found in James Joseph's house, and the iron bridge over Trace Creek, just as the entrance to the village, remained anchored and intact. Mr. and Mrs. Perry Mannon, who was mentioned earlier, Mrs. Perry Mannon was actually the daughter of Mrs. Sayer, had gone to Scotttown to visit her mother, and Mrs. Sayer's home was in the center of town, just west of the pike, and the water came rushing down the valley. They saw that the flood was imminent. Mr. Mannon went for a horse to rescue them, and while he was absent, the house itself was washed off its foundation and carried down to the bottom. Mrs. Mannon kept her mother's head above water as long as possible, but ended up, to save herself, was compelled to let her mother loose, and Mrs. Sayer died. Mrs. Mannon stood in water up to her chin for 2 hours before she was rescued. She was either standing on a bed or on the windowsill with her head as far up as she could get towards the ceiling. It was reported later that Mrs. Mannon died 10 o'clock Wednesday morning, but the time that the article was written, no one knew if that was true. It was also purported that Dr. E. N. Miller lost all of his medication, or drugs, it says, and his library. But obviously the Mannon and Sayer family suffered one of the greatest loss. And that is just part 1, and there is more to come about the Scotttown flood.